All right. Good evening, everybody. Good evening in Pakistan and good evening in Moscow as well. Even though we have like 2 hours difference, and I am looking forward to my conversation with Ladislav. Thank you so much for making some time for this conversation, which I think is pertinent and need of the hour, I think. um, how the international politics are reshaping and what's happening so rapidly in the West and everywhere, actually, especially with the new regime in the United States and all-out tariff war that is ongoing, or trade war, we can say, is ongoing. It's We are at the intricate times, especially if you look at the relations with the West, with the East, specifically with China. And the player that everybody is, I would say, uh, is not talking about is the EU. Um, to the audience, my students and other fellows, if you guys have any question, please write it in the chat. And one second. Uh, yeah, it's not blurred. Moscow is not blurred, but the background is blurred because we are in our rooms and it has to be blurred. Sorry for the inconvenience. If we were sitting in some cafe, we would let you see the view as well. But since we are in our rooms, we cannot show you. So yeah,
It's secret.
yeah, it's a secret. Since we are here, we have to keep things discreet, I would say. So let me introduce our guest, um, Dr. Ladislav, who is a non-resident fellow at China-CEE Institute, Budapest. And let me have a brief introduction to his profile and what he's doing, and then we'll start the conversation. So, Mr. Zemánek is a non-resident research fellow with the China CEE Institute in Budapest and an expert of Moscow-based Valdai Discussion Club, which I've been reading a lot these days, specifically when I'm doing my research on Global South. He collaborated with the Parliamentary Institute of Czech Parliament and the Czech Academy of Sciences. After graduating from Eastern European Studies, he received PhD in history at Charles University of Prague, where he was looking at relations between China and the Soviet Union. Mr. Zemánek has published several articles on current transformation in international order and liberal authoritarianism in the West, which is very interesting, and I would love to talk about it as well. And and he has also has written about Soviet perestroika. Please correct me if my pronunciation is wrong. And China's
Yes, it's
reform.
perfect.
Thank you. Sino-Russian and Sino-European relations and Russian political thought. He was hosted by Chinese Academy of Social Sciences, Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, Serbian Institute of International Politics and Economics, Moscow State Institute of International Relations, where we are right now, McGimo, Academy of Sciences, and the University of Hong Kong. And these are there. He's also has contributed to China Daily, China Radio International, Guangming Daily, and Rossiyskaya Gazeta, Sputnik, and several outlets. Welcome, Mr. Zemánek. Thank you so much for making some time. And let's start our conversation, please. Over to you.
Um, thank you, Asif, for inviting me to our today's discussion, and I'm looking to it, and I'm looking forward to your questions. So I think regarding my introduction, I think it's sufficient. I have nothing to add, so we can proceed to our today's topic. So I'm not sure whether I'm to talk on my own or you ask something.
So I have some questions that I would like to start with, and then we can take the conversation forward from there. And to the folks who have joined us, please write your questions in the chat, and later in the later part, when we complete this discussion, we can have your questions as well. So further ado, I would start our conversation by asking you that how does EU deal with China? Does it deal China as a one unit or like separately? Like, for example, if you look at Germany, is the major component of EU, a major state with a huge economy and has lots of business with China. Please.
Yeah, it's actually a very good question and important question at the same time, because the situation of the European Union is specific in this regard, because the European Union is a community of several or 27 member states, and it's not a sovereign entity like China or the United States, Russia, India, Pakistan, and other countries. So it complicates, of course, the relationship with other foreign partners or actors in this regard, because uh, different member states have different national interests or different priorities, different perspectives on what is going on in the world at the international stage, and of course it affects their relationship with China. But at the same time, there is an increasing tendency to centralize the decision making and shaping foreign policy in the European Union. And it is true that there is a common foreign and security policy framework within the European Union. But the problem is that um, it requires any decision making requires anonymity. It requires full consensus of all member states, which is, of course, uh, or it can be very challenging and difficult to reach an agreement between or among all member states. So there is some countries or actors within individual member states call for the change of the mechanism how the common foreign and security policy is carried out in the European Union, and they call for the introduction of majority voting. So in that case, only more than a half would be enough for taking clear stance on foreign policy issues. Um, so from my point of view, this is the basic tension or contradiction within the European Union as far as foreign policy decision making is concerned. So to answer your question, both is true, because individual member states can have or can have their own policy on China, but at the same time, Brussels and the center or the EU elites, of course, have their own perspective on China, and they have their own interests regarding China, and there is a permanent tension between these two poles within the European Union.
Oh, great. So this takes me to my next question, and one thing that every, for example, student of international relations who is looking at EU and China would ask you or would ask any expert on EU-China relations is that EU is one of the primary markets of Chinese products, and it's a huge consumer market for Chinese products as well. At the same time, we see EU, especially Germany, whose 3% of GDP is with China, you may say the part of its GDP is, and then the trading and the economic profits that it makes is like 6% of its the whole GDP. Uh, there is this imbalance of trade. How I would say that we can say that there's Chinese protectionism against Western products that are going towards China. And at the same time, Chinese products that are coming into Europe, there is not those that much tariffs. For example, if we take the example of EV, electric vehicles, China has become the one of the largest exporters of EVs, and Europe is a huge market for that. And there's only 10% tariffs comparatively. We've seen now in the US, there's more tariffs on that. So how do you see this imbalance of trade between EU and China relations? Do you think China has a monopoly or some sort of edge over EU, or how EU is looking at it?
Of course, it's a kind of advantage for the Chinese side in the relationship with the European Union, and maybe a certain bargaining chip for negotiating with the European Union. And it is undoubtedly true that the trade imbalance is a frequent topic in any discussions about China within the European Union, and it's always present in the negotiations between the EU representatives and China, because of course the European Union or European representatives and politicians would like to change the balance or the imbalance and make it more balanced than today. And so from the European point of view, it's a problem. But at the same time, China is the main producer. So and in Europe there is a strong demand for Chinese products. So it's not only about Chinese protectionism or European protectionism, but there is a demand and offer. So it's a basic economic law, and of course both sides should try to rebalance the relationship or the economic exchanges and economic relations, and maybe it can be also connected with the discussion within the European Union about access to the Chinese market, because of course there is a lot of restraints and limitations and restrictions for foreign subjects who would like to enter the Chinese market and do business in China. So undoubtedly, it is a very complex and comprehensive problem and topic, and it cannot be reduced only to the trade imbalance as such, but also it should be, and it is usually connected with such topics or problems like investment, because for example, the comprehensive agreement on investment was one of the flagship projects of the European Chinese cooperation before the pandemic, and now it's suspended. So it's also a part of the problem. The investment conditions in both China and the EU, the possibilities of entering the European market on one hand and the Chinese market on the other hand. So it's a very complex issue.
Yep, great. That leads to another point that I would like to ask is that there has been discussion among the European Union members of de-risking EU from China, or some you may say that to less dependent on Chinese products or Chinese market or its investment in Europe or European investment in China, especially because of how we see its close relations with the United States in terms of NATO is there, NATO alliance is there. And how do you see that de-risking policy or discussion that is going on in EU?
It's a very serious discussion which is going on in in the European Union regarding the risking or decoupling, because there is these two terms are different and both are in use, both the risking and decoupling. And decoupling is usually connected with the US approach, while the representatives of the European Union prefer to speak about the risking, even though the boundary between them is blurred, and maybe it's only a question of terminology, while the content can overlap with each other. But the de-risking strategy is a part of the so-called geopolitical shift or turn in the European Union, which was launched in around 2019 under the first European Commission of Ursula von der Leyen, who started to emphasize geopolitical aspects and factors in the interactions with other with other entities like the United States, China, India, African countries, and so on. And at the same time, the European authorities or EU authorities started to think about the development of what is usually called strategic autonomy, which is a favorite topic of, for example, French President Emmanuel Macron. But it is still only an idea. It doesn't exist. It doesn't exist in fact, in reality, and the risking is aimed to reduce the risks emerging from cooperation with countries which are seen as a potential risk or even threat, like for example, China. And the de-risking strategy can be demonstrated on the thinking about China in Brussels, because, as you know, China started to be described or perceived as a partner, competitor, and a systemic rival at the same time, which reflects the change in perception of China within the European Union. Because, for example, 10 years ago or at the beginning of Xi Jinping's term, the situation was completely different, and Chinese investment, Chinese companies were welcomed in the European countries and in the European Union as a whole. And there was almost no discussion about security aspects of mutual relations, and it changed. It changed even before the war in Ukraine. It changed even before the pandemic. But these two, I mentioned these two events or processes not by coincidence, because they contributed to deepening the tendency toward de-risking and securitization of relations with other countries, especially those who are perceived as non-democratic. Uh, Again, like China, not to speak about Russia. It's, of course, it's for sure. Maybe I would like to add another thing, that this thinking or reasoning about the risking and decoupling strategies is also linked to the narrative of uh, clash between democracies on one hand and the so-called autocracies on the other hand, which is in turn linked to Biden's administration foreign policy strategy. All of these aspects should be taken into consideration.
Do you think this de-risking strategy or decoupling strategy has gained traction because China's support to Russia in this Russia-Ukraine conflict, and Europe or the West has, started to look at China? Of course, there is a great power competition is ongoing, but Europe has been, quite neutral because it has a lot of business with China. But this de-risking strategy, does it stem out of this China's staunch support of Russia?
Undoubtedly, the conflict in Ukraine deepened this tendency, but it existed even before 2022, as I mentioned. But it was a very important factor, the war, I mean, in accelerating these security security-oriented approaches in the European Union and also in individual member states, because China was accused of supporting Russia. In this line of reasoning, Russia and China formed a alignment or camp which was in opposition to what the European Union and the United States represented. From this point of view, it was perceived as a security risk or threat, and therefore it had strong impacts on de-risking strategies.
Fascinating. Let's come to the main topic of our discussion today is about China's global outreach that we talked about, we have been discussing. That we have seen China emerge as a global economic engine, and we see China as aspiring to become a central power by 2049. If we look at Xi's statements and his agenda or ambitions, and if we look at those ambitions, historically for the past 50 years, China has emerged as a great power and has leaped forward, where it emerged as a major component in international politics that has raised all these debates. So we saw Belt and Road Initiative, and we've seen its intensive engagement with the developing world, and it has even engaged with Eastern European countries, the 16 plus one, cooperation. Um, Now, I want to ask you that how does EU look at China's these grand initiatives like security initiative, the development initiative, and the civilization initiative, because these are the major components of Chinese diplomacy and Chinese grand agenda for the next 2, 3 decades. How does EU look at it? Is it some confrontational policies of China, or is there a possibility of cooperation between these these entities?
I think there is always an opportunity or chance for cooperation, but it's true that unlike the Belt and Road Initiative 10 years ago, or more than 10 years ago, we can observe higher skepticism and mistrust or suspicion regarding these Chinese initiatives, because the Belt and Road Initiative was mostly welcomed by almost any member state in the European Union, and even at the union's level. But the situation, the international context, the environment changed dramatically since then, and it influenced the current position of the European Union and individual, at least some European countries toward China, including these China's initiatives, which form the basis of the current China's narrative about regarding global governance and globalization and the international order. So the European Union as a whole didn't join these initiatives, but of course, as I said, the situation can change, especially if the tension which appeared after Donald Trump's victory in the United States presidential election appeared between the United States and European Union. So this tension can have some influence on the EU strategy and its relationship with China. So it opens the door, or it can at least open the door to some revival of cooperation between the European Union and China. But even in that case, I think that we will not see any enthusiastic support for the Chinese initiative on the European side.
Fascinating. Very articulated answer. So while we are discussing about EU is looking at China as a potential player in terms of cooperation or competition. There's one aspect which is the contemporary part of contemporary politics, and we've seen that there have been great discussion about it, where the minerals, the rare earth metals. We've seen that the US is pushing for a deal with Ukraine for its rare earth metals. And if we look at EU has dependency of 98% of these rare earth metals on China, because most of these rare earth metals are processed in China, which are critical for the technology, right? So how do you see China having monopoly over EU in rare earth metals, and how you can step away from it and look at where China has been accused of, even some cybersecurity, as cyber espionage and many other things, and still there is this dependency as well. So what do you think about it, and what do you think you can do about it?
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned the concrete specific figures, because it's very, very important for the discussion. Yeah, it's true that the European Union is dependent on China in some important areas, and the European authorities are well aware of this fact. and that's why they are worried, of course, because China tries to protect its own sovereignty and resilience and security of its political and economic system, and the EU would like to do the same. So that's the reason for the de-risking strategy, which we discussed earlier, and that's the reason why the European Union tries to diversify its partners abroad and establish or build uh, the so-called safe supply chain, which is again related to the perspective on the international affairs and international community as a whole through the prism of democracies and autocracies, in a sense that there are, from the European perspective, or maybe it would be better to say from the liberal perspective, there are countries which are friendly because they share the same values, the same political system, and operation of their political regimes. And there are at the same time countries which are different, which are less democratic, or they are not democratic at all, like China. Uh, and from this perspective, they try to deepen cooperation with like-minded countries, even though it's not of course limited to Europe or the United States, but anyone who share the same or claim allegiance to the democratic, so-called democratic values and to liberal democracy, they are perceived as a friendly nation or friendly country and partner. And it's important in terms of relations to China to emphasize that Taiwan is perceived as a partner, as the country which shares the same values, shares the same political system and political culture, and so on. And that's why the European, or at least some European countries, try or have tried to deepen cooperation with Taiwan in the field of semiconductors, where Taiwan is one of the leaders globally. And this is exactly an example of the risking strategy. And as a method how to reduce the dependency on China.
Thank
So,
you.
for example, I can mention the example of the Czech Republic, my home country, which under the current government is developing intensive and close ties with Taiwan and the Taiwanese authorities, including in the field of semiconductors. So, and at the same time, they argue that it's a part of the de-risking strategy and reducing dependence on China, which is perceived as a potential security threat.
So, as perceiving China as a security threat, there is a very pertinent thing that I want to ask, which is part of your research as well. That is China's security initiative, and we've seen that China has engaged intensively in terms of its economic cooperation with many countries through its Belt and Road Initiative, through its Three Eyes project, the global initiatives that it is doing. So it is. What it's doing is it's increasing China's stakes in many countries. And we see that when a country has its more stakes in other nations or in other markets, it makes that country responsible to provide security where it has its assets, or you may say it has its interests. For example, if you look at the Middle East, China is brokering a deal between Saudi Arabia and Iran, a peace deal that it did. It is a pure example of China having its increased cooperation there and a threat to its trade. So it's kind of became a guarantor of security in those countries. So how does EU perceive China's global security initiative while it has NATO, right? And China now building these cooperations. And do you think in future there can be some sort of confrontation in this aspect or in this area?
I would start with saying that it's difficult to define what the security, the global security initiative is, in fact, because it's rather a vision of or idea. It's not an institutionalized mechanism, or it's not an organization. Uh, so it's not a clear structure. It's rather an idea, or um, how to rebalance or change the global governance in the security field. Of course, at this level, there are important differences between the Chinese vision and Western approach to security. You mentioned NATO. It's a very good example because NATO is an exclusive alliance, which is close, which is limited to several countries, and it's undoubtedly true that it improves and strengthens security within the alliance on the territory of participating countries. But at the same time, it deepens contradictions or provokes conflicts beyond its borders. And that's exactly what both China and Russia criticize regarding NATO and the organization or security or military organizations of this kind. They criticize the exclusive nature, which means that they improve their position to the detriment of others. And instead, both China and Russia call for the concept of indivisible, universal security and inclusive security architecture, which would avoid creating divisions between countries, and instead favoring the cooperative approach toward security, and equal approach to all countries, regardless of the differences in their political system, economic system, and so on. So from this point of view, I don't see opportunity to link NATO with the global security initiative, because the nature of the approach is completely different.
All right. Uh, there's an elephant in the room that we have to discuss. The elephant in the room is the current tariff war that is ongoing. And if we look at this security initiative and the EU's close relations with the United States, now there's a new new regime. Trump administration has been pushing EU to take care of its security or pay more to NATO, that they say you do not pay as much as the United States is paying for the NATO. So with this current trade war or the tariffs that the US is putting on, even European states, do you think it can push the EU towards China and or make the European Union look for other options or on self-reliance or building some sort of network where there is less involvement in terms of security and in terms of economy of the US? Do you think that, or is China would look to, or the EU will look towards China as a replacement, or you may say, an increased cooperation?
Theoretically, it can contribute to revival of cooperation with China. Undoubtedly, I was surprised when I heard opinions of some European politicians who were very anti-Chinese in the last years, and after the presidential elections when Donald Trump assumed power in the United States and started implementing his policies, they started to call for closer cooperation with China, which was quite surprising for me. But in a sense, it's quite, or it can be an option theoretically. But overall, I think that the European Union should use or make this crisis or make this tension and the recent developments an opportunity for itself. It is eventually the opportunity for it to build what they wanted. I mean, the strategic autonomy, reduce the dependence on the United States, reduce the dependence on China, be more assertive, maybe be more geopolitical if they want, and they obviously want in Brussels to do it. So they should stop criticizing what the United States do, and instead they could concentrate on themselves, on building the strategic autonomy and more pragmatic partnership across the globe. But at the same time, I have doubts that the EU elites and authorities are able to do it, because they are so deeply connected with the idealist approach to foreign policy and to the so-called liberal internationalism, that I doubt that they are able to change the position substantially and start a completely different strategy, like some member states. I can mention in this regard, for example, Hungary or Slovakia, which are not so important countries within the European Union, but still their foreign policy strategy is completely different from what we can see at the union's level. They promote sovereignty, or they emphasize sovereignty, the right of every country to choose their own way of development. They emphasize the significance of national interests. They oppose liberalism and the liberal internationalism, and instead, which makes them closer to to the countries of the global south, for example, including China or Russia. So uh, we can see that the situation in Europe is quite complex, and the ways how the developments will develop further can be different. Uh, it's an open. There is a opportunity for different scenarios. So we will see whether the current tension between Europe and the United States will lead to some rapprochement with China or not, but it can at least.
Fascinating. I would like to ask you about in the similar scenario where we see this escalating trade war have started, and China has been the first to respond and putting retaliatory tariffs on US products going there. So there's this increased great power competition or rivalry. The Sino-US rivalry is ongoing. Do you think you can play any role in terms of some rapprochement, as you have mentioned, in this rivalry, where it can, it has a history of such experiences where we know that the world wars are there, and so EU has come out of that, and somehow it 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 made a system where there's a cooperation, even though there are a lot of differences among the EU states, and still there's cooperation, and still there is, a common good. Do you think you can play this role between the two great powers for some sort of, cooperation?
You mean whether the European Union can play an active role in solving problems in the relationship between the United States and China?
Yes.
I don't think so. I don't think so, because the European Union, even though or despite its economic role and economic power, is weaker and weaker. And I think that we can demonstrate it on the current developments around the war in Ukraine and the current crisis of rapprochement or normalization of relations between Moscow and Washington. Even though Ukraine is in Europe and the European Union perceives the war as an existential matter or existential risk or direct security threat to itself, we can see that the United States don't or doesn't perceive the European Union as an equal partner. Of course, because the European Union is not a equal partner. The European Union was always subject to the United States, so it's not surprising. But therefore, I don't think that the European Union could play any role in the relationship between China and the United States. Such a role would be more likely be played by Russia, for example, but not by the European Union.
Interesting, very interesting perspective. Uh, I would take our conversation further, and I would ask you about. We have seen China being a leading nation in some of the tech, in 5G, in artificial intelligence, and many of the new innovations are coming out of China, and especially under its digital Silk Road that it is developing. How do you look at, from the EU perspective, as a concern that an authoritarian regime having these innovations where you would have been or could have been or should have been one of the leaders in tech. So how does EU see China's tech dominance? We saw that with the United States pressure, it had to drop contracts on 5G technology coming from China. So how much of it is a risk for the EU, or how the EU perceive this tech innovation coming out of China? Or, yeah.
I think that the perspective uh, on these developments or deepening or accelerating dominance of China in these industries is rather as a risk for the European for the European Union, and we can demonstrate it on several examples when such companies as Huawei are expelled from the European market or from certain fields like critical infrastructure and so on. And we can see that, for example, security bodies or intelligence agencies of many European countries warn against any cooperation with the Chinese companies in these fields. So from at least from the perspective of the security apparatus of European countries or the European Union, it's a risk and even a security threat. And that's why they called for or initiated uh, the de-risking strategy and other measures which were aimed to reduce dependence on the Chinese partners, including the implementation of new legislation at the union's level, like the foreign subsidy regulation or anti-coercion instrument or critical raw material act, and all these legal acts were aimed at reducing the dependence on Chinese companies, especially in these critical or strategic areas. From my point of view, those in the European Union who were afraid of the Chinese companies and Chinese technologies and emphasized or focused on promoting the cooperation with like-minded countries and the United States must be very concerned at the moment because they face the profound changes which are going on in the United States and their strategy. So undoubtedly, the situation for them, for the European countries and for the European Union, is very complicated in this regard because they can turn again to China, but in that case, they would it would contradict to their former policies, like the risking policies, or they can cooperate with the United States, which are quite hostile to the European Union at the moment. So it's a complicated situation for Europe.
Yeah, that's very diplomatic and very articulated answer, I would say. So it takes me to the end of our conversation, and I have like one last question, which is some sort of a hypothetical question. That is about how do you see China becoming successful in achieving its initiatives, or China's aspirations that it has? though they have talked about they do not want to be, challenging the global supremacy of the US, but it aspires to be one of the great powers who dominates at least its area of influence. So, how do you see China succeeding in its initiatives, especially the three initiatives that we're talking about and we've been talking about, and its other engagements?
It is yet to be seen, but I think that we should distinguish between different regions because China is much more successful in the so-called global south.
Yeah,
It is much more successful in cooperation with Russia, and it's much less successful in the relationship with the United States and Europe, or the so-called collective West, which is not very collective at the moment. So, so um, it is clear that China has ambitions to shape the future or the emerging new international order and set the rules of the new global governance model, and that's why Beijing launched these initiatives, even though they are blurred, or it's not institutionalized, and maybe its purpose is their purpose, because if they have a clear structure, formal rules, and so on, the chances for promoting them would be lower than in their current shape. So, but in any case, the global, as you mentioned it, outreach, or the spreading of Chinese perspective on security, on the civilizational diversity and plurality, Chinese perspective on political governance, on the political regimes, on democracy, human rights, on modernization strategies are increasingly popular, especially in the countries of the global south. But it can be attractive, or in a sense, it is attractive even for some other countries, including, for example, Hungary. So undoubtedly, the role of China and these initiatives will be increasing. But of course, I don't think so that China will replace the United States as the only global hegemon, as the United States succeeded after the collapse of the Soviet Union, because there is quite a lot of actors, of countries, both major powers or great powers and middle-sized countries like Turkey, Brazil, and others, whose ambitions are quite high, and their aspiration, and they aspire to play an increasing role in the international affairs. So, from my point of view, we are witnesses of the transition to a multipolar order, but the concrete shape is not clear to anyone at the moment, I think.
Very fascinating answer. And let me ask you one final question. And I swear I won't ask you any more questions, even though I have a lot of, because it really interests me to discuss that. Do you think China would be successful or be able to provide an alternative order or somewhat a regional order, I would say, in coming future that can be a replacement of existing order, where we can see that there are some sort of uh, loopholes are being, exploited, or we are seeing the waning of the current international liberal order. Do you think China will be successful in providing some sort of an alternative model or order?
I think it can succeed if the country uh, is able to gain support of other players, at least the main ones, or at least some of the main ones, like Russia, um, and other countries, for example, of BRICS or Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and in that case, it can succeed in promoting or gaining support for its vision of international order. But it seems to me that it's quite improbable that uh, it will be only China as a country which will impose or formulate or define the rules of a new order which will be imposed on others. I don't think it's possible, and I have doubts that China wants to do it. I think it's not its ambition, because it would be exactly the same which is criticized by the Chinese side, because they accuse the West, or especially the United States, of doing this. So if China implements the same strategy, it would lose support and legitimacy in the eyes of the others.
Fascinating conversation, and thank you so very much. It was enlightening for me because I've always been interested in knowing the EU perspective on China, since we have, like, always we discuss China's perspective towards other nations, but listening to a European, how they look at China is fascinating. And thank you so very much. I really appreciate for your time, and you've been kind in terms of giving us your precious time, even though we are working on our research and you've been having deadline to submit your drafts. So do I. And thank you so very much. I really appreciate that. And I really appreciate the people, the students who made uh, time for this conversation. And thank you so very much. And
Especially on
yes,
Saturday evening.
yes, exactly. All right. I would wish you a rest of the weekend, I would say, very best of it. And enjoy your evening. Have a good dinner, and maybe we can catch something together later on. Thank you so much. I really
Yes, we can.
Yes, yes, thank you. So
Yeah.
see you
And
in a bit. We can grab something together and continue our informal conversation about it.
yeah, as you like, we
Yeah,
can. And
definitely.
it's been pleasure to join you.
Thank you so very much. Thank you. Take care.
And
And
I'm looking forward to further cooperation, of course.
yeah, definitely, definitely. Thank you very much. Take care. Take care, everybody. Bye.